The summer sun was unseasonably warm against the grey stone of London, casting long shadows from the tourists who thronged the precincts of St. James's Palace. Among them, a young American man named Kyle Peterson stood out, not for his dress, which was the standard uniform of jeans and a college t-shirt, but for his demeanor. He was on his first trip outside the United States, a graduation gift from his parents, and he carried with him an unshakable confidence that the world was essentially a simpler, smaller place than others made it out to be. To Kyle, history was something that happened in books, and tradition was a quaint affectation, like using a butter knife for something other than stabbing a stick of butter. His attention, like that of the crowd around him, was fixed on the royal guard. The soldier stood perfectly motionless within his small sentry box, a vision of scarlet and black fur. The famous bearskin cap sat low on his brow, and his face was a study in absolute neutrality. He held a rifle, bayonet fixed, with the same casual ease with which Kyle might hold a baseball bat. To the other tourists, he was a photo opportunity, a living statue, a symbol of London. To Kyle, he was something else entirely, a target. "Look at this guy," Kyle said to his girlfriend Sarah, nudging her with his elbow as he pulled out his phone. "Doesn't move a muscle. It's like he's a robot." He started filming, zooming in on the guard's face. "Hey, buddy. Hey, in the big hat. How's the weather up there?" He laughed at his own joke, a sharp, loud sound that cut through the respectful murmur of the crowd. A few people turned to look, as some with mild annoyance, others with the nervous smiles of those who sense a scene brewing. Sarah tugged at his sleeve. "Kyle, stop. People are staring." He shook her off. "It's fine. It's what they're here for. They're a tourist attraction." He took a step closer, crossing the invisible line of respect that the other observers instinctively maintained. He waved his hand in front of his phone camera. "Come on, man. Give us a smile. A wink. Anything?" The guard's eyes remained fixed on a point 1,000 yards away. He didn't blink, didn't twitch, didn't acknowledge Kyle's existence in any way. This lack of reaction only fueled Kyle's determination. He saw it as a challenge, a game of psychological warfare that he was determined to win. "He's probably not even a real soldier," Kyle announced to Sarah, his voice carrying, "Oh, they're just actors, right? Guys in costumes for the tourists. Probably get paid minimum wage to stand here and look pretty." This theory, common among the willfully ignorant, was his justification. You couldn't mock a real soldier but a guy in a costume? That was fair game. He started making faces, pulling his own ears, and doing a silly little jig on the pavement. The crowd around him began to thin out, people uncomfortable with the spectacle he was creating. They moved away to view other guards further down the palace walls, leaving Kyle, Sarah, and a few curious onlookers with their own phones out, filming the fool rather than the guard. His antics continued for several minutes. He tried to get the guard to break by telling bad jokes, then by simply staring at him and giggling. "You can blink, you know." I won't tell anyone," he taunted. Sarah was mortified, her face red. She pleaded with him one last time. "Kyle, please, you're being an ass. Let's just go see Big Ben." But Kyle was enjoying his audience, even if that audience was now just a handful of people. He felt powerful, witty, above it all. He represented a country that had won every war that mattered, right? This little island and its ceremonial puppets had nothing on him. It was then that he decided to up the ante. He took a deliberate step onto the cobblestones of the palace forecourt, a space that was clearly demarcated as off-limits. It wasn't a gate, but a subtle change in the pavement, a line that no one else had crossed. He raised his phone again, now only a few feet from the guard. He didn't see the figure approaching from his peripheral vision. He didn't hear the steady, deliberate footsteps over his own laughter. The first thing he knew was a voice, calm, clear and utterly authoritative that cut through the air like a knife. "Sir, step back onto the pavement. Now." Kyle spun around. Standing behind him, cradling a black military-style rifle, was a Metropolitan Police officer. He was part of the armed response unit that protects key London sites, and his eyes, fixed on Kyle, were as cold and hard as the stones beneath their feet. He wasn't a guard in a fancy hat. He was a policeman with a very real gun, and his face conveyed a message that brooked no argument. The blood drained from Kyle's face. The confidence evaporated in an instant, replaced by a cold knot of fear in his stomach. He quickly stepped back, muttering, Sorry, I was just—" The officer didn't look at him. He turned to the immobile guard and had a brief, quiet conversation. Then he turned back to Kyle, and now the crowd, which had magically reappeared, was watching with rapt attention. Sarah had disappeared into the background, wishing the ground would swallow her up. The officer's voice, when he spoke, was quiet enough that people had to strain to hear, but in the sudden silence of the street, every word carried. "This soldier," the officer began, pointing a thumb at the man in the box, "has recently returned from a tour of duty in Afghanistan. He has seen active combat. He has watched his friends die. He stands here today not as a prop for your amusement, but as part of his duty. A duty that includes protecting this palace and its inhabitants. He does not react to you because he is a professional, trained to ignore provocation and maintain his post. It has nothing to do with you." Kyle stared, his mouth agape. He looked at the guard, but saw him with new eyes. He wasn't looking at a costume anymore, but at a young man, barely older than himself, whose face, now that he looked closely, held a deep, abiding weariness that had nothing to do with standing in the sun. The officer continued, his voice hard as flint. "You come here, to a foreign country, and you mock one of its servants. You mock its traditions. You think it's a joke. But let me tell you something about this nation you feel so free to ridicule. This is a country that stood alone against a tyrant who had conquered all of Europe. While other nations fell, while some waited and watched, the people of this island, back in their cities and their towns, endured nightly bombings. They sent their young men and women into the skies and onto the seas, knowing many would not come back. They did this not for glory, not for conquest, but because they believed it was the right thing to do. They stood firm, just as this soldier stands firm today, against a far more dangerous foe than a disrespectful tourist with a cell phone. The officer's words painted a picture in the air. Kyle could almost hear the wail of the air raid sirens, feel the thud of distant bombs, see the defiant resolve on the faces of a beleaguered people. He thought of his own comfortable life, his biggest worry being which bar to go to on a Friday night. The contrast was so stark, so humiliating, that he felt physically sick. "You owe this man an apology," the officer concluded, nodding toward the guard. "And then you will leave this area. We do not appreciate your behavior." Kyle, his face burning with shame, looked at the guard. The soldier's eyes, which had been fixed on the horizon, shifted for a fraction of a second and met his. There was no anger in them, no triumph, just a deep, profound disappointment. It was the look a person might give a child who should know better. Kyle mumbled, "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry." He turned and walked away, his head down, his phone forgotten in his hand. He could feel the eyes of the watching tourists on his back, a physical weight of judgment. He didn't look for Sarah. He just walked, wanting to disappear into the anonymous flow of the London crowd, a city that suddenly felt very old, very deep, and very, very unimpressed with him. The shame from the incident at St. James's Palace followed Kyle like a persistent shadow. It clung to him as he and Sarah, in stilted silence, took the two back to their hotel. Sarah was angry, not just embarrassed. She had seen a side of him she didn't like, an arrogance that was ugly and small. She told him she needed some time alone and went for a walk, leaving Kyle in the sterile quiet of their room. He didn't try to stop her. He just sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the wall, replaying the officer's words over and over. Hey, he has seen active combat. He has watched his friends die. The phrases circled in his mind, clashing with the image of the stoic, statue-like figure in the box. He pulled out his phone, the same phone he'd used to film his mockery, and, with a hesitant thumb, he typed into the search bar, British Army, Afghanistan. The screen filled with images and articles. He saw young men and women in dusty camouflage, their faces gaunt with exhaustion, their eyes holding the same distant look he'd seen in the guards' eyes. He read about Operation Herrick, the Helmand province, the temperatures that could reach 50 degrees Celsius in a body armor suit. He saw photographs of patrols through narrow, muddy alleyways, the threat of an IED, improvised explosive device, lurking beneath every stone. He clicked on a news article about the Grenadier Guards, one of the regiments that provides the King's Guard. He learned that these weren't just ceremonial units. They were front-line infantry troops. He read about their deployment to Afghanistan in 2009, and a tour that cost the battalion 5 soldiers killed in action and dozens more seriously wounded. He saw the faces of the fallen young men with bright smiles, their lives cut short in a dusty land thousands of miles from home. He saw the photograph of a young guardsman who had lost both his legs to an IED. The soldier's face in the photo was one of grim determination, a survivor's resolve. Kyle thought of his own perfect, unblemished body, and a wave of nausea washed over him. His search widened. He looked up, London Blitz. He found black and white footage of the city's skyline, the familiar silhouette of St. Paul's Cathedral, surrounded by flames and smoke. He read first-hand accounts from civilians, ordinary people who had emerged from the underground each morning after sleeping on platforms, to find their homes, their streets, after their neighbors, gone. He learned that over 40,000 civilians were killed during the Blitz, a campaign of sustained bombing meant to break the spirit of the British people, and it didn't work. The articles spoke of Blitz spirit, a term he'd heard before but dismissed as nostalgic fluff. Now, reading the words of the people who lived through it, he understood it wasn't about jingoism. It was about a quiet, stubborn refusal to be cowed. It was about getting up, making a cup of tea, and carrying on. His research took a more historical turn. He stumbled upon a UNESCO page describing the Palace of Westminster, the seat of UK Parliament. He learned that the very ground where he'd been standing, the area around Westminster and St. James's, had been the center of power, religion, and monarchy for over 1,000 years. And he read about Edward the Confessor building his church in the 11th century, about kings and queens being crowned, married, and buried in Westminster Abbey for centuries. The sheer weight of time, the unbroken chain of history began to press down on him. He thought of his own hometown, a suburban development built in the 1990s. The oldest building was a 7-Eleven. The contrast was not just vast, it was incomprehensible. Then he found a page on the Tower of London. He read its description. Built to protect the gateway to London and declare Norman supremacy over a defeated population, the Tower of London is a symbol of royal power, fear, and a reminder of the last time England was successfully invaded and defeated. The last time England was successfully invaded. The year was 1066, nearly 1,000 years ago, and he thought of his own country, where the concept of old meant the 18th century. He thought about the idea of a nation that had not been successfully invaded for a millennium. What did that do to a people? What kind of resilience, what kind of cultural DNA did that forge? He read on. learning that the tower was not just a fortress, but a palace and a prison. It was where 3 English queens were executed, including the young Anne Boleyn. It was where prisoners were tortured and held for years, their stories haunting the ancient stones. And yet, it still stood. It was still a functioning royal palace. It still held the crown jewels, the symbols of a monarchy that stretched back over 1,200 years. This wasn't a museum piece. It was a living, breathing artifact. He delved deeper, looking for the character of the British soldier, and not just in war, but in their very being. He found articles about the British military's ethos. He read about the core values of the British Army: courage, discipline, respect for others, integrity, loyalty, and selfless commitment. He scoffed at first. All armies had those. But as he read further, he saw how these values were ingrained, not just through training, but through a deep connection to history and tradition. He read about the role of the monarchy, how members of the royal family had served in the armed forces for generations, from the Queen's father, King George VI, who served at the Battle of Jutland in World War I, to Princes William and Harry, who both served on active duty in Afghanistan. He read about the meticulous, almost obsessive attention to detail in the British officer corps, as how cadets at the Royal Military Academy Sandhurst would spend 2 hours a day polishing their boots and an hour ironing their uniforms. The article explained this wasn't vanity. It was about building habitual discipline, creating a state of mind where attention to detail became second nature, a discipline that could save lives on a chaotic battlefield. The piece quoted a Chinese observer who noted that habitual discipline was the bedrock of British military effectiveness. Kyle looked at his own untucked shirt and scuffed sneakers and felt another pang of shame. He thought about the guard again. He understood now why he hadn't moved. It wasn't about being a robot. It was about the deepest, most profound level of discipline imaginable. It was about honoring his regiment, his comrades, and his country by doing his duty, no matter how mundane or how provocative the circumstances. He had stood there, a recent veteran of a brutal war, being taunted by a privileged tourist, and he had not flinched, not because he was a machine, but because he was a man of immense self-control, a man who understood that his post, his duty, was more important than his personal pride. Kyle had mistaken that profound inner strength for weakness. The realization was devastating. The following day, Kyle was a changed man. The swagger was gone, replaced by a quiet, contemplative air. Sarah, still wary, agreed to accompany him, but she noted the change. He was polite to the tube station attendant. He held doors for people. He walked with his hands in his pockets, his eyes not on his phone, but on the city around him, seeing it not as a playground, but as a living chronicle. And they took a bus to the heart of the city of London, the ancient square mile that was the original Roman settlement. He wanted to see more, to understand more. They walked past the Royal Exchange with its grand portico and the Bank of England, a fortress-like structure that guarded the nation's wealth. Their destination was the National Army Museum in Chelsea, though Kyle didn't know exactly what he was looking for. He just felt a pull to understand the institution that produced men like the Guard he had mocked. The museum was quieter than the central London attractions, filled with families and military enthusiasts. He moved through the galleries, barely speaking, absorbing everything. He saw the Formation Gallery, which detailed the origins of the British Army from the political turmoil of the 1600s. And he saw a quote on the wall from Field Marshal Sir William Slim, a great World War II commander. "The soldier's pride and loyalty are not first to the army as a whole, but to his own corps or regiment. They hold him when more distant, wider loyalties could not." It clicked into place. The guard wasn't just a soldier. He was a grenadier guard, or a Coldstream Guard. His loyalty was to his regiment, a family with traditions and history stretching back centuries. His fallen comrades in Afghanistan were part of that family. He saw a display on the Grand Review of the Army at Hounslow Heath in 1687, one of the earliest formal musters of the British Army. He saw the uniforms, the weapons, the meticulous organization. He moved through exhibits on the Napoleonic Wars, the Crimean War, the Boer War, the trenches of the Somme, the beaches of Normandy. Each display was filled with personal stories, letters home, medals, and photographs. He saw a Waterloo coatee, a jacket worn by a major at the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, its provenance confirmed by modern forensic analysis. He was looking at the actual clothes worn by a man who fought in a battle that ended a world war over 200 years ago. The object bridged the gap between history as a concept and history as a lived reality. He spent a long time in the section about modern conflicts, about Iraq and Afghanistan. He saw the kit the soldiers wore, the weapons they carried. It was the same as the Guard's ceremonial uniform, but in camouflage. He saw a photograph of a soldier from the Welsh Guards, a young man with a broad smile, holding a child in a dusty Afghan village. And he read the caption. He was killed by an IED 3 weeks after this photo was taken. Kyle felt a lump form in his throat. He thought about the guard's weary eyes, and he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that the man had stories like this, memories he would carry for the rest of his life. As they left the museum, Sarah took his hand. She didn't say anything, but the gesture was a forgiveness, an acknowledgement of his silent penance. Kyle looked back at the building, a modern structure, housing the memories of centuries of sacrifice. He had come to London expecting to see the sights. He was leaving with a completely new understanding of what a sight could mean. The Tower of London, the Palace of Westminster, the Royal Guards. They weren't just pretty backdrops for selfies. They were monuments to a people's endurance, and their struggles, their grief, and their incredible, stubborn resilience. He had come to mock, and he was leaving in awe. On their final full day in London, Kyle asked Sarah if she would go back with him to see the guards again. She agreed, a little nervously, but she saw it was important to him. They went back to St. James's Palace. This time, Kyle stood at a respectful distance among the other quiet observers. He didn't pull out his phone. He just watched. There was a different guard in the box today, a fresh-faced young man who looked even younger than the previous one. He was just as immobile, just as stoic. Kyle knew nothing about this soldier. He didn't know if he'd seen combat, if he'd just finished training, or if he was about to be deployed, but it didn't matter. He represented the same thing. And he was a link in a chain that stretched back 1,000 years. Kyle's eyes were drawn not just to the guard, but to the palace itself. He saw the soot-blackened stone, the small windows, the solid, unadorned walls. He imagined the people who had walked those halls. Kings and queens who had wielded absolute power. Prime ministers who had steered the nation through war and peace. Princes who had been born, lived, and died within these walls. He imagined them looking out of these very windows, perhaps watching a different guard, in a different uniform, standing in the same spot, protecting them from a different threat. He thought about the vastness of British history, a story that began before his own country was even a European dream. He thought about the Roman walls that still stood a mile away, the Norman castle that guarded the river, the medieval abbey where kings were crowned, the Victorian Parliament where modern democracy was forged. It was all here, layered on top of itself, a palimpsest of human experience. He was standing in the middle of a living history book, and for the first time, he was actually reading it. He saw a mother with two small children pointing at the guard. The little boy, about 5 years old, waved excitedly. The guard, of course, didn't wave back. The boy's mother whispered something to him, explaining that the soldier had to stay very still. The boy nodded solemnly, accepting this with the simple logic of a child. Kyle felt a pang of nostalgia for that innocence. He had come here with the arrogance of a man who thought he knew everything, and he was leaving with the humility of a student who had just realized how much there was to learn. The afternoon sun cast long shadows again, but Kyle didn't feel the need to be the center of attention. He was content to be an observer, a respectful guest in someone else's home. He and Sarah stood for nearly an hour, watching the guard, watching the tourists, watching the ebb and flow of life around this ancient symbol of continuity. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. The silence was comfortable, a shared understanding. Later that evening, as they packed their bags for the flight home, Sarah asked him, "So, what did you think of London?" Kyle thought for a long moment. He couldn't sum it up in a joke or a quip anymore. "It's not what I expected," he said slowly. "I thought it would be old, but I didn't understand what that meant. It's not just old buildings. It's old feelings, old loyalties, old grief. That guard, he wasn't a statue. He was a monument, a living one." He paused, running his hand over the rough fabric of his jeans. "I was such an idiot, Sarah. I'm so sorry you had to see that." She came over and sat next to him on the bed. "You weren't yourself," she said gently. "But I saw you change. I saw you learn. That's more than most people do on a vacation." She squeezed his hand. "It's okay." Kyle knew it wasn't entirely okay, not yet. The shame was still there, a permanent scar on the memory of his trip. But it was a scar he would carry with him, a reminder of the day he learned that humility was not a weakness, and that respect for others, especially for those who serve, was the bedrock of any decent human being. He had traveled 3,000 miles to learn a lesson he could have learned at home. But he knew, and with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he would never forget it. He would never again look at a uniform, any uniform, and see a costume. He would see the person inside, and he would wonder about their story. The flight home was smooth and quiet. Kyle stared out the window at the vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, a watery barrier that separated the New World from the Old. He thought about the first settlers who had made that crossing centuries ago, carrying with them the seeds of their own culture, their own traditions, their own griefs and loyalties. He thought about how young America was, how brash and energetic, and how, in its quest to be new, it had sometimes forgotten to honor the old. He wasn't going to become a Britophile. He wasn't going to start putting on airs. But he was going to be different. Now, back in his suburban town, everything looked the same. The same strip malls, the same cars, the same conversations. But Kyle felt different. He saw his friends with new eyes, noticing their casual arrogance, their certainty that America was the center of the universe. He didn't judge them, not anymore. He just understood that they hadn't seen what he'd seen. They hadn't stood before 1,000 years of history and felt its silent weight. A few weeks later, a news story broke online. It was a video, taken by a tourist, of an American being confronted by an armed police officer in London for mocking a royal guard. The article described how the group of American tourists had been heckling a tired-looking guardsman, trying to get a reaction, until an officer stepped in and gave them a stern lecture. "These soldiers serve their country. They take their job seriously. They are not an object of ridicule," the officer was quoted as saying. The story had gone viral, with hundreds of thousands of views and thousands of comments. Many of the comments were from Brits defending their guards, but many were from Americans, and they were vicious. They called the tourists ugly Americans, entitled brats, embarrassments. They said the officer was a hero. Kyle read the comments with a hollow feeling in his stomach. He recognized himself in that video. He was the guy in the story, just a few weeks earlier. He watched the footage, seeing the laughing faces of the tourists, hearing their jeers, and he felt a profound sense of kinship with the guard. He saw the exhaustion in the soldier's eyes, and he understood it now. He scrolled down to the comments section, and one question, posed by a user, stopped him cold. Would they ever do this at the tomb of the unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery? Of course not. So why do they think they can do this to our military? The question hit him like a physical blow. The tomb of the unknown soldier. He had been there years ago on a school trip to Washington, D.C. He remembered the stillness of the crowd, the solemn click of the sentinel's heels on the marble, the profound, reverent silence. He remembered the feeling of awe, of gratitude, that had washed over him as he watched the soldier march, 21 steps, turn, 21 steps, over and over, guarding the remains of an unknown American soldier from World War I. He had felt proud, humble, and deeply moved. He had never, not for a second, thought about mocking that sentinel. It would have been unthinkable. It would have been a desecration. And yet, he had done the exact same thing to the exact same kind of soldier, just in a different country. The realization was a final crushing blow to his remaining pride. The guard in London, with his bearskin cap and his red tunic, was the British equivalent of the sentinel at the tomb of the unknown soldier. He was a symbol of sacrifice, of service, of the ultimate price paid by generations of young men and women. The uniform was different, the hat was sillier, but the meaning was identical, and Kyle had mocked it. He had mocked the very thing he held sacred in his own country. He closed his laptop and sat in the dark of his room. The lesson was complete. It wasn't just about respecting another nation's traditions. It was about understanding that beneath the different uniforms, different accents, and different histories, there were the same fundamental human truths. There was courage, there was sacrifice, there was a duty to something larger than oneself. The soldier in the bearskin cap, the sentinel at the tomb of the unknowns, the Marine at the embassy gate, they were all brothers in a fraternity of service that transcended national boundaries. Kyle had failed to see that. He had seen only the surface, the strange hat, the funny uniform. He had been blind to the depth, the meaning, the profound human story behind the stoic facade. He knew he would never be able to undo what he had done. He couldn't take back his words or the look of disappointment in that young guardsman's eyes. But he could carry the lesson forward. He could be a better man. And he could teach others, by his own example, that travel wasn't about collecting photos or proving your superiority. It was about opening your eyes, your mind, and your heart to the vast, complex, and beautiful tapestry of human experience. It was about learning that every nation, every people, has its own sacred places and its own revered guardians, and that they all deserve the same respect you would want for your own. The American visitor who mocked the Royal Guard had learned a sobering lesson about Britain's past. But more importantly, he had learned a profound lesson about his own humanity, and the universal duty we all share to honor the service and sacrifice of others, no matter what hat they wear.